Hello and good day to you. This is Tracy Harrison from the School of Applied Functional Medicine. The topic for this month is about practitioner skills, and in particular, which skills are likely going to be of the most importance in helping you to actually maximize your patient and client clinical outcomes. I am the founder and the lead instructor here at the School of Applied Functional Medicine, and over the past 11 years, we've had the great privilege, the honor of educating thousands of healthcare practitioners from about 22 different modalities, professional modalities, coming from currently about 75 different countries around the world. And we've had the great pleasure to learn from all of these practitioners who have been able to showcase and share with one another based on their scientific expertise, but also based on their clinical prowess, their professional wisdom on what makes the difference between a well-intended, well-educated, maybe very intelligent, even erudite practitioner, one who is able to get amazing outcomes in working with their diverse patient population in terms of forming that incredible savvy clinical partnership with each individual patient, and those folks who are very well intended, very smart, but they just aren't able to get those amazing outcomes. And I want to focus on this topic today because we've certainly learned and seen, it's a very humbling and sacred experience to see just how much getting ho-hum, suboptimal, sorta, kinda clinical results for your patients and clients is a major source of burnout for practitioners. Of course, where everyone is in this field, in this industry, because being a part of helping people to find their greatest wellness, to rediscover and then maintain their true vitality so that they can give richly and with great generosity and reciprocity of their gifts, whether they are a mother or a father or a teacher or a peacekeeper or a poet or an engineer or a scientist or another healthcare practitioner. People give most grandly and generously and creatively of their personal gifts when they feel great, when they don't just feel okay or fine or getting by, but when they feel high vitality, then they are able to give their greatest gifts to the world. And this is where all of us as healthcare practitioners have a tremendous opportunity, I believe a sacred responsibility, to give the best of our skills to the people we're passionate about serving in our practices so that they can turn around and share generously from their gifts. And I just want to, first of all, acknowledge that I deeply appreciate there are many practitioners out there who are committed to excellence. You want to help create and empower wildly satisfied, high vitality patients and clients in your practice, but you just struggle to do that, or to do it consistently. And certainly there are obvious reasons why that might be. Indeed, functional medicine, in terms of working most commonly with chronic disease dynamics, we've spoken many times about the tools, the assessments, the approach in acute care or emergency care, acute disease treatment or disease management. What best thrives in that particular slice of the healthcare pie tends to be quite different from what is most effective when we are looking at chronic disease reversal and regression and the actual step-by-step restoration of functional balances that allow people to not only get well but stay well on an ongoing basis. And that this, of course, is not just about the practitioner's skills and the practitioner's actions and interventions. It's also about what you are able to ignite in partnership with the patients and clients that you serve so that individuals are educated, inspired, and empowered to change their lives, to make different choices on a day-over-day basis about all of the different habits and behaviors that establish and affirm and maintain health foundations. That naturally allow the body to be more resilient in the face of unexpected challenges on an ongoing basis. And so While we certainly acknowledge the power and the importance and the absolute blessing of living on the leading edge for many of us, I think, in emergency and acute care, today I want to acknowledge some very different, in some cases, skill sets that are critically important with regard to maximizing clinical outcomes through the functional medicine lens, and specifically with regard to helping people not just manage, but ideally transcend chronic disease dynamics. And the first one I want to acknowledge, first of all, is knowledge, scientific understanding. Of course, this is essential, absolutely essential for having true capability through the functional medicine lens. Do you understand not just the superficial level, but do you understand the nitty-gritty of interconnected physiological functioning and the biochemistry that fuels that physiology? You must absolutely understand that. And it's one of the things we're obviously passionate about here at the School of Applied Functional Medicine is teaching that from a core root foundational educational perspective, not just enabling people to memorize facts and concepts, but teaching them through repeated exposure to really richly understand them. I think it's really hard for any practitioner to have strong capability and true confidence. And confidence is one of the biggest balms to overwhelm, by the way. If you feel a little bit like a pretender, or perhaps have a little bit of imposter syndrome, or I'm not really sure I know what I'm doing, it's going to be very challenging for you to feel confident, and very challenging for you to be able to do this work without feeling overwhelmed, because that's that constant niggling negativity and questioning in the back of your head. And certainly education, scientific knowledge is critical for that. But I want to balance the scientific understanding, which is perhaps a skill or a capability that we all would agree to. I want to balance that with the skill of humility. And I'm referring to humility as a skill rather than a trait, because humility is something we act on. It is an action. And especially through the functional medicine lens, I think it's critical that all of us understand and acknowledge and then act in the truth that science is not a static, emphatic, final framework for evaluating the world. Science is constantly evolving. Scientific understanding, by definition, is never done. It's never fixed. And it requires a sense of openness and humility in order to have all of your preconceived notions, your prior assumptions, the prior understanding you based your practice on, to have these things flipped upside down by new scientific understanding, not to resist having your understanding poked at or weakened, or to have questioning come into mind in light of new research, new published peer-reviewed science, for example. We have to keep an open mind. We have to keep a humility that allows us to constantly question what we may have taken for granted in the past. And this, by the way, also includes, I believe, a humility and openness to being questioned by your peers. Sometimes we can get in a very egoic place where we're asserting our excellence, we're asserting our credibility by being unassailable, by not being willing to be questioned, not being willing to receive input from others, especially from those that we feel may have less experience or a less impressive set of degrees or licenses than we do. And we get into this sort of credentialed infighting and hierarchy that I don't think serves our clinical outcomes at all. Because when we have multimodality teams, when we have a mixture of people who are quite seasoned and those who are more novice, who are perhaps less blinded by years of experience, we are likely going to bring the best of our collective insight, that grand rounds intelligence and creativity to the table for helping unique clients. So I think humility is one of the most often overlooked skills. Perhaps the mark of the true master is the knowledge of just how much we don't know, just how much is uncertain, and just how much more there is to learn. One is never done with learning functional medicine. In fact, I think we're living just in the sort of initial, sort of second quartile momentum of the collective whole of functional medicine understanding and insight that's going to come in the next few decades. And so this requires lifelong learning, an openness to seeing what we may have missed, and a willingness to be questioned, a willingness to have others point out what we might have missed. And instead of feeling threatened, instead of feeling challenged, to be grateful for having a like-minded community of peers, of colleagues that we can be supported by. The other skill that I think we all well understand and would agree is critically important is case assessment. And indeed, functional medicine honors the complexity in real live chronic disease cases. And functional medicine tends to attract not the light and moderate cases, but the richly complex ones where people have not just one diagnosis, they have 2 or 5 or 10. They're not just taking one medication, they're taking 2 or 5 or 10. They don't just have 3 or 4 symptoms, they may have 30 or 40, and you may be the 4th or 5th practitioner they've seen. So on top of that, they're somewhat disillusioned and jaded and maybe skeptical. And so this is by definition a complex clinical encounter. And case assessment is critical. And yes, functional medicine highlights the value of quantitative lab assessment. We can learn a lot, especially from more advanced or more esoteric targeted laboratory inquiry. But you've also heard me say many times before that I think part of functional medicine's branding problem today is an over-reliance on labs. I certainly have spoken to a number of curious and hopeful but skeptical patients who are quick to say, I'm concerned that instead of just getting diagnoses that are going to be treated with drugs, I'm going to have to pay a lot of money for a lot of labs that are going to be treated with supplements. And how is that different? And there are many ways in which that can be quite different. It can be much more beneficial because we're more likely to address the roots of physiological and biochemical imbalance. But to the patient's credit, there's also a lot of short-sighted potential pitfalls in that approach. And I still think in functional medicine, many practitioners have an over-reliance on labs. And as we teach on a nitty-gritty level, there are pitfalls and misinterpretations and missteps to be made in all types of labs. There are multiple reasons why various labs could be high or low. And we must become quite savvy in not jumping to conclusions based on labs, but also not getting lab tunnel vision, where we start to discard the patient's life experience, the nuances in the patient's story, or their intuition about what's actually happening with their body, because, the labs don't agree with that. The labs don't play that out. And we can start to make the same mistake of always prioritizing what the quantitative lab assessment says over the much richer, perhaps more intuitive source of intelligence that comes from the more qualitative aspect of the patient case. And I believe one of the best practitioner skills is being able to balance both of these things. At SEFM, we talk about the skill of puzzle piecing. Just like if you took a jigsaw puzzle and dumped out all the pieces on the table, there's all these different colors and patterns, and it can be really overwhelming. And it's a skill to be able to flip over all the pieces and start to move them around and start to form clusters of pieces that fit together. Maybe because they have a similar color in them or a similar pattern, or it's all the corners or the edges. There are similar rubrics to use in the functional medicine world that can help you to see how puzzle pieces fit together to start to explain the burgeoning picture of the disease dynamics in a unique patient. But we have to go beyond labs to do this. We must start to balance. Yes, labs can be important, but we must not become overly dependent on them. And I believe, I'm very passionate about, we must learn to be incredibly effective as practitioners without the benefit of labs. Sometimes labs simply aren't available. Maybe no labs at all are available, or maybe only basic everyday annual physical labs. Simple blood labs are available. And can you still be an incredibly effective practitioner without the crutch of being able to get a stool test and a food sensitivity test and a toxicity test and an organic acids test and a nutrient panel and so on and so on and so on? I know from experience, yes, you can be an incredibly effective practitioner without all of that data. Is it beneficial? Yes, but we must cultivate the flexibility of working without it. Part of that is being able to glean the massive amount of often overlooked wisdom that comes from everyday blood labs. I'm amazed at how often we see in clinical practice that everything, the vast majority of what you need to know is already there in simple blood labs, but we still ordered $4,000 worth of follow-on complex labs where the pearls of how to move forward were already there without the patient spending thousands of dollars for additional confirmation or additional detail that just wasn't needed at that point in time in order to plan wise next interventions. At the end of the day, we should be looking at additional labs because we think it's going to change emphatically our clinical interventions. It's a part of the responsibility of being a good fiduciary agent for your patients. $4,000 worth of labs would buy a whole ton of healthy food, of a little more time off, of some yoga classes, of some childcare to allow more date nights with one spouse, or to purchase a little bit of help with the housework or other things to bring stress relief. And so being a good fiduciary agent, I believe, is important. Integrity prompt for all of us as practitioners. So coming back around, moving from the concept of just assessment and thinking about only labs and maybe symptoms being all you need for case assessment versus seeing those as but perhaps 2 of 8 or 10 different aspects of effective puzzle piecing, where we equally honor all of the qualitative components along with all of the quantitative components, and that we learn to include the patient's story and also the patient's intuition. One of the most powerful, revealing questions that you can ask any patient you serve is this. Okay. Regardless of how crazy it may sound, regardless of how anyone may have judged your insight before in the past, I would love for you to just share with me, bluntly, honestly, what do you think are the 1 or 2 most powerful reasons, most powerful root causes or drivers of why you're sick right now? And then we stop talking. And we don't bias their thinking by telling them what the right answer is. We stop talking and we let them say what they have thought about, probably in and out of day over day, month over month, year over year, observing their own life. And yes, we have scientific understanding and a different level of maybe objectivity in looking at their particular presentation. But we should never presume that we have more exposure to or insight to a case than the patient who's living in this body 7/24 on an ongoing basis. We have to create space for them to share what they believe triggered it, what they believe is sustaining it, what they believe is most at the root in continuing to exacerbate a given disease dynamic. Sometimes people have been criticized, ignored, maybe even humiliated, made to feel silly because of what they thought. Maybe no time was ever made for them to talk. They were simply, or to share, they've been simply talked at and told what the right answer is. And if we want to help someone to truly get well, and most importantly, to stay well, we've got to broaden our definition of assessment to include the full concept of puzzle piecing. A third piece that we know is really essential for being effective through the functional medicine lens is having plentiful education and a big toolbox. And certainly that may include some concepts of protocols. Right? Absolutely. Fully understand that, especially in certain disease dynamics that you have a lot of clinical experience with, you may not be referencing a handy dandy chart. You may have a lot of deep, rich clinical experience yourself. You may be quite seasoned, and whether it's written down or not, you have in your head some of the most common protocols that you use, which is an awesome strength to bring to any clinical intervention. And we need that wisdom, that bastion of experience in the world of functional medicine. But we must balance what we think about as a protocol, sort of a standard approach, a functional standard of care, if you will. This is the way that you address H. pylori. This is the way that you address insulin resistance. This is how you stabilize immune hypervigilance for asthma so you can start to address the root causes, right? These sort of standard protocol approaches. Well, a skill is being able to stay in the space of beginner's mind. I actually think increasingly that beginner's mind may be the most important skill set for a practitioner who uses functional medicine to have. And beginner's mind is about being able to stay in the space of being present for the case with an open mind, without already thinking ahead of time about what the right answer is, but with an open mind so that you don't miss the nuances, the contraindications, the considerations, the vulnerabilities, the interconnectedness that will tell you, especially if you're seasoned, how to customize your approach for this unique person. So that instead of having a cookie cutter approach, for the things that we tend to specialize in our practice, we have a basket of tools and we become quite skilled at using a variety of tools depending on who this unique person is in front of us. This is about helping to ensure that we can satisfy the diverse considerations of the people who present to us, and so that we see them as a unique human being, right? We see Mary, who's 36, who was sexually abused as a teenager, who has estrogen dominance and heavy debilitating menstrual cycles. Oh, right, and she's hypothyroid, right? We see Mary, and we see Mary with all of her nuances and all of that rich interconnectedness, rather than Mary's just another hypothyroid patient, right? And not to imply that any of us would be so acerbic in the division, but sometimes we're dealing with such a focus on standard of approach and standardization of solution that we lose the critical skill of nuanced implementation, nuanced clinical intervention that helps to better ensure that Mary is not going to just feel a little bit better, but Mary has a much better chance of getting fully well and staying well, because we saw Mary with all of her unique nuances in terms of how to best support her, rather than Mary is an autoimmune hypothyroid case, and there are things that should help Mary in that particular sense. And so I think beginner's mind, the challenge with beginner's mind is that the more you know, the more knowledge you have, the more clinical experience you have, beginner's mind becomes harder to maintain, not easier. In the beginning, when you're learning functional medicine, it's easy to understand and be really comfortable with, okay, wow, there's a lot I don't know. I need to start from scratch and thinking about everything from a blank sheet. I want to be careful with assumptions. I don't know enough yet to have a lot of assumptions, but I want to be open-minded. The more we learn, we tend to jump to conclusions about the best interventions. We also tend to jump to conclusions about what are the disease dynamics that play in a different case. And that may be diagnostic in terms of giving it a formal label, or it might be labeling a disease dynamic that you're going to aggressively go after. This is how people get caught up in, all brain fog is post-COVID, or all craving sweets is or candida overgrowth, all postmenopausal hypertension is maybe increased lead excretion from bones because of age-related osteopenia or osteoporosis, right? There's a lot of if this, then that type of assumptions, as opposed to being able to step back and say, okay, that's one option, but let me approach Mary's case with a fresh mind, without the assumptions of, quickly jumping to conclusions of this looks like that. This cluster of symptoms always means estrogen dominance. This cluster of symptoms always means hypochlorhydria. This cluster of symptoms or labs always means an autoimmune disease. And being able to step back and simply have that thought, but table it. And then to ask ourselves, okay, but if it's not that, what else might it be? So that we can be more thorough and have more openness and bring more wisdom and possibility to our assessments. And we don't get blinded on many levels, blinded by our experience, blinded by the assumptions that our wisdom leads us sometimes to make. Okay, another balance that I think is really important, related to, of course, protocols, has to do with the effectiveness of those choices, right? In terms of helping someone to address a certain disease dynamic. Do we know the dietary choices that would help? Do we know the lifestyle changes that would help? Do we know the food, the mindfulness tools and practices that might help? Do we know a given supplement that might help, or an app that people could use, right? These are all powerful tools, and we need to have a good toolbox, and we need to choose carefully and with good wisdom and insight. But I want to talk for a moment about the balance between treating a patient versus educating, inspiring, and empowering a patient. Because the whole concept of treating disease comes from the very appropriate practitioner-centric model of acute and emergency care. Or disease management, right? Where people are not really, they're coming for a completely different set of goals in partnering or in working with a certain healthcare practitioner. Where a practitioner-centric model and a directive approach to communication and a expectation of compliance and assessment of compliance is appropriate given the goals of disease stabilization and management. But when someone is coming to you for help through the functional medicine lens in order to assess, identify, reverse disease dynamics, and then maintain a higher state of vitality, we're very unlikely to have amazing clinical outcomes if we maintain the approach of, you're the patient, I'm the practitioner, I'm going to bring understanding to you, and with my interventions, I'm going to fix you. I am the healer, you are the recipient of my healing, and I am going to give direction or instruction to you that I expect you to be compliant with, which is a very obviously practitioner-centric model, right? And certainly in the world of disease care, it can be incredibly effective, especially in an acute or emergency scenario. I'm not criticizing that. I'm questioning and challenging the effectiveness of that in the realm of chronic lifestyle-mediated disease. Because another huge branding problem that functional medicine has is that a lot of these treatment, intervention, fixing approach might actually help someone to get well. And I will say to you what I've learned from the privilege of supporting thousands of practitioners and many, many thousands of cases over the past decade is that people tend to be compliant as long as they're afraid. It makes perfect sense. They don't understand what's happening in their body. They're deferring to an authority to tell them what to do. They're much more likely to be quiet and meek and to listen and to follow instructions. And they're afraid, and they're deferring to someone who has more knowledge and in their view, the authority in the relationship. However, when we know that people's day-over-day lifestyle choices and habits are a massive, not a small, but a massive component of why they are where they are today from a chronic disease perspective. The challenge with compliance is that as people start to feel better, they stop being compliant because they're not afraid anymore. They feel a little better. They feel like, okay, I was afraid before because mom died of a heart attack and I thought I was going to do that too and maybe soon, but I'm feeling better. My blood pressure's come down. My drug doses are coming down. I'm feeling safer. I'm feeling more secure. I can go back to what I was doing before. And so we get into this vicious cycle of disease promotion and compliance and disease promotion and compliance versus if our focus is on education, helping the individual patient to actually understand in language they can process what's happening in their body. So they have not just a clear understanding of the instructions that they're supposed to go and do, but they actually understand in simple analogies and stories what's happening in their body. They have oh, is that what's causing that? Oh my God, I've never understood that. So when I do this, it's making this worse. I had no idea. When we speak to people and we're not using a lot of erudite scientific language or medical ease, but we're using simple terminology and diagrams and handouts that they can understand, and they have an aha experience and a really enlightening one where they go home and they tell their spouse and their friend and their colleague, hey, I learned yesterday what's actually causing my fill in the blank. You're not going to believe this. Let me teach you about it. Let me tell you about it. And the more they share with others, the more they galvanize in themselves knowledge, education that makes it very hard for them to step away from. Because then you can inspire them with the lifestyle choices and changes that they could make that could actually get rid of those disease dynamics. And then we're placing in their realm of authority, in their realm of choice and empowerment, being at the patient being in the center of the healthcare encounter, their responsibility to take back their health and own it and to make choices on a day-over-day basis, because it becomes very hard for them to unknow what now they clearly understand about disease dynamics in their body. And then lastly, empowerment is about giving them tools, maybe creative tools that they didn't understand. They have deficiencies of certain nutrients, helping them to identify a couple of targeted foods that they can prepare and enjoy that would give them a bolus boost of that particular nutrient. Maybe helping them to find creative ways to improve their sleep, depending on their particular flavor of insomnia or disrupted sleep. But we empower them with tools, with solutions, with things that are convenient and affordable and accessible. So that they're like, all right, I understand, and now I get the power of my choices, and I'm feeling that responsibility. And now you're telling me it's maybe more straightforward and more accessible than I thought. This brings a whole level of activation for your patient that is never going to happen with the cycle of compliance and fear-driven practitioner-centric direction in a healthcare encounter. And I think this is an essential skill for practitioners to master. And I so want to appreciate and say thank you for those of you in particular who have one foot in the conventional medical world, and you may do quite a bit of disease care and maybe acute disease intervention, and you've got one foot in that world and you've got one foot in functional medicine, and you're feeling this need for having a diverse set of skills and customizing your approach depending on the goals of the particular encounters, and feeling the need for a different approach in those different worlds. The next piece I want to mention is from a skill set viewpoint is about the ability to set expectations right up front. We live in a culture of quick fix. We live in a culture where people are used to popping a pill and they feel differently in a half an hour. Popping a pill that emphatically shifts or numbs something artificially in their body so they get some sort of relief. And this tends to shift, even in ways we don't tend to speak about or acknowledge, people's expectations that if I'm getting good guidance, if this practitioner knows what they're doing, I should feel better pretty darn quickly. And even if they haven't told me what to expect, my experience clinically is that people give you about 2 weeks at most. And if they're not feeling significantly better, they start to question, hey, when is this going to work? And how come I'm not feeling better yet? And I actually started these particular parts and I'm feeling worse in these ways. And so much of whether people develop a placebo versus a nocebo effect as they begin to work with you, and we know that there's powerful biochemistry behind those differing belief systems, whether or not a person imbues you with confidence and positive expectations, and they start to trust you and share more of their intuition and their story with you and to feel inspired by you, has a lot to do with what happens up front early on in the encounter. And so much of their feeling about you 3 or 4 weeks or 3 or 4 months into your program with them is simply about setting expectations. If we don't tell people realistically how often it typically takes to reverse a certain disease dynamic, they're way more likely to assume it's going to be faster than it most typically is. It's why when we're talking about, for example, helping people who are stepping away from sugar, who are trying to have a lower glycemic diet and are actually trying to get away from not just switching from lots of sugar to lots of artificial sweeteners, but we also want them to get away from lots of lohan or lots of stevia or lots of honey and just allow their taste buds to adjust to where they don't need whole natural foods to be sweetened. So they're not constantly feeling in tension with their diet, like they're being deprived. They're craving something they can't have that's not good for them. A huge part of that, as we know, is helping people's taste buds to recover so that something like a simple apple or a plain sweet potato with nothing on it tastes fantastically sweet and satisfies those taste buds, satisfies that craving, and that this takes time. Well, if you don't educate people, my experience after helping hundreds of people with this is that they don't think it should take longer than about 2 weeks. Well, my clinical experience is that it takes between 6 and 8 weeks. Depending on the degree to which they have fully withdrawn from sweetening foods. And of course, people may need a transitionary window. Going cold turkey for this type of thing, especially where cravings are involved, usually doesn't work. So we have to have tools. So people may need some short-term support with lower glycemic sweeteners, and there's lots of choices. But setting the expectation that the goal is to transition to something and then wean it down to allow the taste buds to adjust, and teaching them that this typically takes 6 to 8 weeks. And you may start to feel that other foods taste richer, that they don't taste as bland as you move along. And then if it takes them 4 or 5 weeks to experience any change, they feel like they're ahead of the curve, as opposed to feeling like 2 weeks in, this is never going to work. Why bother? I quit. Let me go right back to putting 5 packets of Splenda in my coffee. Expectations are everything, and it's critical that we set expectations up front and setting them conservatively so that ideally people do better. They experience relief sooner than the expectation that was set, and then they feel like they won. They're doing better than the curve, right? Woohoo, we did it. I responded more quickly. That bodes well for the other things we're going to work on. If you don't set expectations, people are more likely to think about reversing an autoimmune dynamic. How long could that possibly take? 3 months? Most people think 3 months sounds like forever. It's a season. Well, most of us know in clinical practice, the likelihood of it happening in 3 months is very slim, especially because even with the appropriate interventions, maybe for addressing things like infectious dynamics or restoration of T regulatory cells or fixing zinc or vitamin D status, right? There's plenty of intervention related things, but sustainably changing diet, sustainably changing sleep, sustainably changing use of toxic personal hygiene products. These things don't happen overnight. 6 months bare minimum, right? But the typical autoimmune reversal is much more likely to be a 9 to 12 month a journey, sometimes appreciably longer, depending on all the confounding distractions and how many times people get off in the weeds on their progressive path to make sustainable lifestyle change. Whether or not they stick with the journey, whether or not they have an active placebo effect, whether or not they believe in you and your skills and your ability to help them as a unique case, heavily is leveraged by expectations. So we must set them up front. And we also, as part of expectation setting, want to help them understand that your work together in a savvy clinical partnership is going to involve a layered series of targeted interventions that you can bring some science, some wisdom, some assessment, some tools to the table for, balancing those interventions with their making lifestyle change. An intervention and a lifestyle change, an intervention and a lifestyle change. Because this is about reversing a disease dynamic at the same time that we're reinforcing a foundational aspect of health. And when you're oscillating between these two things and building a strong, sustainable foundation together, you make it much more likely that the improvements people reap because of your interventions have a hope of being resilient, have a hope of being sustainable in the face of unexpected life events. It also helps your patient to get out from under sitting and waiting to be fixed, waiting for you, the authority, to fix them, which can leave them in a space of not having the appropriate level of responsibility and accountability and action that is needed in order to sustainably reverse lifestyle-mediated diseases. We need them in a space of not only empowerment, but also responsibility, accountability. But we have to set that expectation right up front. And that getting their buy-in that now is a good time. And while you believe in their ability to transcend this disease dynamic, they need to affirm and bring to the table that I'm ready. I'm ready. I understand my role in this partnership. And I'm open to change. I feel like now is a good time and I have some support systems in order to do this. You're in, I'm in, let's go for it. These are expectations we want to set up front, not later on down the path when they're frustrated and disillusioned, where we're frustrated because of the constant regression of improvements simply because expectations weren't appropriately set early on. One of the aspects of progress in a clinical partnership that we need to be asking about on a regular basis is pace. Some people come to us crazy educated, right? They know a lot about their disease dynamic. They may be their full-time hobbies might be about learning about functional medicine and watching summits and educating themselves. And while I can appreciate that sort of an egoic sense of certainty that they know more than the practitioner can be frustrating, how wonderful that a patient is passionate about it and wants to learn and wants to fuel their understanding. They want to get it. I believe that's something we can celebrate while also being very crystal clear about where we don't agree with them and where we have a different understanding and clinical experience with the application of that science. Some people like that are ready to go. They want to move quickly. They want to learn a lot. They want to work on multiple changes at once. They want to be given multiple tool options. They want to work at a fast pace because if not, they are likely to get frustrated with the sluggishness of improvement. They may be constantly pushing. They may get bored. They may feel like they're not being given enough to do, and so they start investigating things on the side, and they may decide that, now is a great time to go and change my life in this way without understanding how that could derail their process. because we're moving too slowly for them. We're being too delicate. We're being too hesitant. But on the other hand, we can be way too aggressive and cause just as much of a problem in our clinical partnership. We can be recommending too much too fast. We're trying to educate them. We're forcing in too much information. They want to just slow down. They want to start with simpler changes, simpler interventions. No, they don't want to eliminate gluten 100% from their life tomorrow because it completely freaks them out. Because how am I going to eat breakfast? And how am I going to feed my family? And how am I going to shop? And how am I going to eat at this restaurant where I go to get my meals every day at lunch? And they're totally overwhelmed. And so the whole notion of you must be 100% gluten-free, that's not happening, right? They need a slower approach. After we educate them about why gluten matters, they need us to ask. So given that knowledge and given an eventual goal of removing gluten from your diet, what feels like a good first achievable goal for working in that direction? Those are great kinds of questions because sometimes people say, oh, 100%, I'm in. In fact, I hardly eat it anyway. It's no big deal. They may be totally ready. It's not a problem. Or let's add other stuff. What else should I not be eating, right? What are other things that might be increasing inflammation? Other people may say, okay, how about if I just start by trying to identify where gluten is in my diet and eating less of it? That's my first step. That feels doable because I don't even know how big the problem is now. And I'm totally overwhelmed by thinking about changing something I don't even understand. Okay, fantastic. That's a great goal. It's a place to begin. As Lao Tzu says, right? The journey of 1,000 miles still begins with just the first few steps. If we overwhelm people in the first few steps, we have no hope of them being with us at the mile marker, much less the 1,000-mile marker. And so we want the first few goals, the first few lifestyle changes to be achievable, right? We want them to be SMART goals, right? Things they're ready for, things that feel achievable, that have a specific success measure, so that they can say, I did it, and we can celebrate, which is the next on my list of key clinical practitioner skills. We must celebrate. At the end of the day, we all want encouragement, regardless of how sort of left brain, professional, credible, scientific, emotional we might be. Oh my gosh, we all want the gold star. We all want the A+. We all want the picture on the refrigerator and the woohoo and the, oh my gosh, you're saying it's not very much. I think it's great. It's a giant step in the right direction. We can build on this now. We need to celebrate every step along the way. Every time we meet with someone, we should be celebrating what happened. We should be celebrating progress, whether it's small, medium, or large. Celebration creates the openness to the next set of actions. And we want to be sure that we set people up for a whole bunch of wins in the beginning in particular, not a whole bunch of, I tried, but I failed. I tried, but I only did it twice. Okay, 2 is so much better than none. You tried it. Fantastic. That's awesome. What did you learn? What did you experience? What can we learn from the 2 times that can make it easier to address the other 20? So that we create some successes, we create some wins that people can feel like, all right, I'm capable of this. Like, all right, I may have only made a few steps, but I'm beyond the starting line. I'm off and running. And despite all my doubts, I might actually be able to do this. I wasn't sure, but I'm feeling optimistic now, right? We need that optimism early on because it doesn't matter how intelligent you are. It doesn't matter how amazing you are scientifically as a practitioner. If your patients feel overwhelmed or like a failure or like they didn't do enough in the early stages and too many of them just give up, that's about them and about the partnership we create. And there are way too many practitioners who have a lot of knowledge, a lot of understanding, but it's not transcending into these amazing health outcomes because this clinical skills piece is just not there. We tend to marginalize it as being soft skills, Well, my experience, tens of thousands of cases later and thousands of practitioners later, is it's where the rubber hits the road. It's where the science matters at all. Otherwise, we just have a whole bunch of scientific knowledge and we're geeking out together for fun. But if we're not able to parlay that into the clinical skills to help people get well and then most importantly stay well, I think we could argue that beyond our own curiosity, that scientific knowledge, even if you're incredibly seasoned and wise and intelligent, that scientific knowledge is not going to be very fulfilling in terms of helping you to be a part of healthcare transformation. These soft skills, this stuff in the middle where the rubber hits the road, is something we've got to magnify hugely as important. It's a foundational part of how we teach at SAFM, in part because the vast majority of practitioners struggle with it. It's not typically taught. And we've got to master these types of skills if we want to feel amazing at the end of the day, because oh my gosh, people are getting well and staying well, and I'm getting these raving testimonials and people are on fire. And I haven't talked to Mary in a year, and her insulin resistance is still gone. Her asthma is still in remission. Her menstrual cycles are still normalized because Mary is on fire. Mary has been activated by not just your scientific knowledge, but your clinical savvy skills application, right? Mary has been educated, inspired, and empowered. So Mary is now activated. She is owning her health. She's on fire. And now she's telling everyone she knows about you and also about, oh my God, do you know what was causing my menstrual cycles? Let me tell you, because I never understood this. It was just frustrating and I had to deal with it. And I thought it was just genetics, or I don't know. I thought all women had this problem, but no, there's reasons. And I learned that these were like 6 puzzle pieces involved in my case. And let me draw you a picture of why it was causing that in me. It's crazy fascinating, right? Mary's on fire. Now Mary herself is part of healthcare transformation because she's creating community. You've activated Mary to create community amongst her friends or neighbors or colleagues, random strangers in her yoga class who are being educated and inspired for Mary. And Mary's going to send you qualified referrals because she's a raving fan. But Mary is not going to be a raving fan if it's just about you and your scientific education, you and your credentials, you and just how deep and esoteric your scientific understanding is. That is absolutely important, but it's not enough. Mary will not be activated to be this driving force in healthcare practitioner, in healthcare transformation, without this savvy clinical skills application. I have one more skill that I want to talk about, and it's probably the most important one, so please don't go, because perhaps the most important, neglected, seriously marginalized, or minimalized practitioner skill is you taking care of yourself. Whew, we're going to teach a whole class on this one. And we talk about it quite a bit at SAFM, because if you are stressed out of your mind, burned out, overwhelmed, overworked, not supporting your own health foundations, doing this work is probably going to be disease promoting for you. And I don't say that to be negative or to be frightening. I say that to just do some truth-telling straight talk. It is so essential that we take care of ourselves, that you take care of you. And contrary to a lot of myths that I hear from practitioners, what I believe is most essential for you to role model is not perfect health. In fact, I would argue if you're perfectly healthy, that might be in the way of your clinical outcomes, because your typical patient is overwhelmed by your perfection. Like, okay, it's easy for you to be healthy because you like healthy food and you have no trouble sleeping and you're just lucky and you won the genetic lottery and you don't understand, you don't get it, you don't get me. You're perfect. How could you possibly understand how freaking hard it is to do this? How could you possibly understand the chaos of my life and why I'm trying to not have cardiovascular disease, but I have 97 other concerns in my life? You trying to be perfect may be in the way of you having optimal outcomes, because people are more likely to believe you have compassion for their scenario, to believe that you have a deep visceral understanding and empathy for the challenges of changing your life, if you have your own road you're on. And what I have seen over the years is that what people would be much more influenced by and supported by is you role modeling a commitment to your health rather than you trying to role model perfect health or perfect lifestyle choices. You role modeling that there's a commitment. And even if I get off in the weeds, even if I, get stuck in places where I can't make good choices, or even where I knowingly am making choices that aren't very healthy, but that's just what I did in that moment. I'm not perfect and it's going to happen sometimes. People see, oh my gosh, you're human, just like me. You are struggle with this a little bit, just like me. You make unproductive choices and wonder, why the heck did I do that? Just like me, right? They're more likely to be inspired and to benefit from your commitment to your health rather than your assertion of spoken or unspoken of perfection. They don't need you to have a perfect weight. They don't need you to have perfect energy or a clean bill of health or perfect labs or anything like that. They don't need you to have any of that. And again, I think sometimes that can be derailing because it feels like the real life gap between you and them is massive. What they could be very inspired by seeing is that you're on your own journey and you have your own challenges too. And I don't believe we need to derail our patients' clinical sessions, forcing the practitioner's story in there. But what people can see is that we have our own journey. We're not perfect, we're working on things too. We have challenges. And we're role modeling a commitment. We get off in the weeds. We don't give up. We get back on track. We get off in the weeds. We get back on track. We stumble. We get back on track. We have some unexpected trauma or crisis. We deal with it to the best of our ability. It's not perfect. And then we get back on track. That is inspiring. That creates a connection of rapport and trust because they see your humanity. Your humanity is not a weakness. We've got to get rid of this veil of perfection in medicine and healthcare, in the sense of belief that somehow there's this bastion community of healthcare practitioners who have perfect knowledge and perfect choices. And then there's the rest of the people who aren't, who have less. I don't believe that, especially in the world of chronic disease, that perception purposefully established or assumed by default. I don't think that's serving the people in our practices. But our self-care, that commitment to our self-care that allows us to be rested and grounded and therefore have a good sense of humor and to have a positive outlook and to be present for the person in front of us rather than 37 other stressors or worries about our own lives going on in our minds, so we're only half focused on what the patient is telling us. These things are essential. I think you investing in a good diet, you investing in a good mindfulness practice, you prioritizing good sleep hygiene, you're prioritizing the fun, the joy, the pleasure, the laughter that fuels you. Friends, these are business expenses. They are essential components of your preparedness to be an amazing practitioner. They're not optional. They're not optional. And way too often practitioners are struggling and they feel exhausted and burned out in doing this work that makes their heart sing, but is dragging down their body and their stamina, simply because somehow we end up with this twisted mindset that deprioritizing ourselves and sacrificing all through some sense of martyrdom for the patient, for the community, for the practice, for the mission, that somehow that is the most honorable out. And that's really kind of sick and twisted, my friends. I don't think there's a lot of that helps to role model anything for our patients and clients, or for that matter, our family members or our children, around how do you fill your own cup first so that the generous overflowing you can, with a grateful and generous, abundant heart, share it with other people, not because of martyrdom, but because you filled your own cup first and you have that abundance to give. You have that extra intelligence, that extra intuition, that extra creativity, that extra compassion, extra everything. You have it to give because it overflows from filling your own cup first. I think this is an absolutely essential practitioner skill. And doing that as a priority could potentially make any or all of the other things I mentioned more accessible. Thank you so much for being with us today. And I want to thank you all for being here and doing this work. Putting yourself out there, being willing to have the compassion, the commitment, the courage to be on the leading edge of the future of effective healthcare for chronic disease. I see you, and I thank you for the privilege and the honor of supporting you.